Hello, welcome to Infinity Unbound and our Get to Secure series that we're doing with the Infinity Group. And this session is navigating the evolving threat landscape and some of the top cybersecurity threats. I'm joined by Tom Lovell and Dave Morrow. Let's say hello.
Yeah, I'm Tom. I'm the CTO at Infinity Group.
Hey, I'm Dave Morrow and I work for Microsoft in our security practice.
And I'm Ian Stretton. I'm a pre-sales architect here at Infinity Group. So in this session, we're kind of going to try to hopefully give the audience an understanding of the kind of that ever-changing cyber security threat landscape. We'll maybe talk about some of the growing sophistication of cyber attacks and threats, and maybe some of the increasing role of supply chain and security breaches and what that means. And also have a look around things like denial of service attacks, multi-factor authentication, fatigue and ransomware and those kind of areas, if that's okay. So just starting off then, let's just talk about what that kind of threat landscape is looking like at the moment maybe, and some of the sort of top challenges that are out there at the moment, and maybe how things will move forward as well.
Identities, so a user identity, they are the biggest target for cybercriminals. They are the route in to an organisation generally as part of a strategy to breach that organisation. And you've got new technology like AI and machine learning helping to drive that threat. Social engineering is one of the terms that would get used a lot, which is where you may be receiving communication from somebody. It may appear to be that person. The language they use may be the same. They're asking you to do something. You've no obvious initial reason to believe it's not that person, but it's not them. It's somebody else. It used to be, the days of the kind of deposed Nigerian princes are gone, and you are now speaking to people who are using the correct language, the correct terminologies. They understand a lot about the business from information that they can gather freely online. They can raid LinkedIn and places like that where you are constantly publishing lots of information about who you are and what you do, and learn enough about you to impersonate you.
Or to impersonate somebody that thinks they know you.
Well, exactly, yeah. And they can use that information to try and gain a foothold. It's always to extract money. That's through either directly intercepting payments or by extorting it through other means, like through using ransomware. And those are still, I say they're still the biggest threats. I mean, they're getting worse in terms of the way that they're being used. I think that remains the ever-growing threat of how more sophisticated it becomes.
And then supply chain, that's part of that. I think, like we just touched on there, again, in terms of acting like an individual to try and get some information out of somebody to then have an attack onto your organisation potentially, but also there's threats from the supply chain as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's twofold, I suppose, in that respect, because you've got suppliers who you're paying money to. Sure, you're definitely paying the money to that supplier. You've got customers that you expect to pay you. If somebody is infiltrating your organisation, then they may be diverting your customer money directly to themselves. But the nature of the supply chain being a global chain, whilst you may be dealing with a business that's in the UK, you don't know what other elements are in their supply chain to deliver the services to you. It's global. That leads to a risk of vulnerabilities depending on how many links there are in that chain and how strong each link is. If there are low tier suppliers in there, they might have poor information security practices. You don't know that necessarily. And they can be the source of data breaches. There's plenty of good examples of where organisations have been subjected to data breaches within their own organisation as a result of something happening somewhere else. A very, very good example of one that still continues to hurt organisations now is the data breach that LinkedIn had over a decade ago. And because people haven't changed their passwords in more than 10 years, they're still having their accounts breached as a direct result of something that happened more than a decade ago. But the same kind of things can happen in any link in the supply chain. And also there's an operational risk to what do you do if a third party fails as a result of one of those events and breaks the chain entirely.
And I think we've got some sessions that will be coming up in the series as well that talk about things that you could look at in the supply chain. So, for example, compliancy regulations that organisations can achieve. So, looking for suppliers or customers that have got those already, they are generally considered as good customers, good suppliers.
Due diligence is key, right? Isn't it? You shouldn't do business with anyone without checking their credentials first, and understanding what you should be looking for in terms of compliance from your supply chain is significantly important. Cybersecurity standards, do they comply with them? Are they carrying out specific practices within their organisation, like user awareness training? Do they have programs for doing those kind of things? And if they're not doing any of those things, they're an immature business, and you really should consider whether you should be doing business with them at all, because of the risk that it represents.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think the worrying stat that we hear from a supply chain point of view, or from any customer point of view, is once an attack or a breach takes place, generally the time for that attack to move laterally within your environment and establish a foothold is measured in minutes. But quite often those attacks go on for months before they're detected. So if someone in your supply chain is breached, there's a good chance they won't know about it for many, many months. So it's really important that you've got that understanding of who you're allowing a connection in or out of your organisation.
The next question I was going to ask, which might lead on quite nicely, is any statistics or sort of any data points? I think the NCSC or the National Cyber Security Centre, certainly in the UK at least, probably do publish some good statistics around that, but I'm guessing you guys have got some insider.
They do. I mean, the one that springs to mind for me from the NCSC for kind of small and medium-sized businesses in the UK is it's about 1 in 2 will experience a breach in the next 12 months, which is an incredibly worrying statistic. And there's lots of others from the NCSC, but I think that's the headline one that really grabs the attention, is 1 in 2. And again, really worryingly, many of those businesses won't ultimately recover from that incident, which is again quite concerning.
Yeah, there's been a specific call from the NCSC recently to businesses to improve their cyber resilience. So, almost accepting that you're going to have an event of some kind, you need to understand how to recover from it when it does happen. So it's more than just trying to lock all the doors and windows. You've got to be able to deal with the problem when somebody just bashes that door in through some other means. Because if you can't recover, then you die.
Yep.
Another stat. I don't think this one is from the NCSC, but something I heard recently, which I thought was quite interesting. If cybercrime was a country, in terms of GDP, it would be the 3rd largest economy in the world, which is just a crazy stat. So about $8 trillion, larger than the UK's GDP, and growing, right? It's big business. It's treated like big business. We hear of lots of these organisations having, incentive trips for their best employees, which is just a crazy thing to think about. But it's happening, and it continues to grow, and therefore we see the volume of attacks increase.
So I think with that, I mean, obviously we've hopefully scared enough to a degree. We have got answers.
We have.
Of course, we've got obviously quite a lot of Microsoft tools and features that we can deploy.
Yes. I think the good news is for some of those stats are quite worrying, right? But I think the good news is actually what we see is quite often basic security controls will address the vast majority of threats that are out there, right? Then there are sophisticated attacks, of course, but the majority aren't sophisticated, and things like patching, not running out of date systems, or in particular, I would call out multi-factor authentication. They're all quite basic security controls that you can all put in place and that will protect you from the vast majority of attacks out there. So There are some scary stats, but it's not all bad news.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think I'd echo that from our own findings in the work that we do, which is that, you know, those sophisticated attacks are reserved for, you know, perhaps state-backed actors or you know, very coordinated attacks against specific critical infrastructure or something along those lines. But, you know, for the smaller businesses, it's a smash and grab. You know, that's what they're looking to do. They're looking to get in, grab some money and run away. And some of the organisations that offer their services to individuals or groups to carry out those kind of things, they offer guaranteed returns on, you know, you can rent our botnet for X amount of time for X amount of money and you're guaranteed to receive this much back. And they're just looking for quick ways to make decent stacks of money. They're not looking to tear the business apart necessarily. That's just a consequence of what happens. But small businesses have a habit of leaving themselves open to that because they don't have even those basic controls.
But I think going back to one of the points you made before around knowing maybe some of the individuals in these smaller organisations, actually there's a lot of automation now that these sort of threat actors can do, isn't it? And they kind of, it's almost like a spread attack, and then there'll be a few that come back, but then they'll go for those, and actually it doesn't matter the size of the organisation in those instances, does it?
I think that automation is there, and I think to build on your point a second ago, for me, one of the really worrying trends over the last couple of years is that skills barrier to entry is so low now, because as you say, you can you can go on the dark web and you can purchase an exploit. And you can purchase a list of customers to run that exploit against, and then you can purchase a network to actually launch that attack, and even outsource the collecting of the ransom. So, someone with very, very low skill set can launch some quite devastating attacks. And as you say, it's not necessarily that you have specifically been targeted. It's just you are vulnerable to that particular issue, exploit, or attack.
We touched on some on the introduction around sort of denial of service attacks, multi-factor authentication, fatigue. I think is one that's out there, especially where you're signing into multiple systems with different identities as well, and things like ransomware. Can we just talk about maybe what some of those threats actually, what they are?
Yeah, I mean, MFA fatigue's a good one to think about, because it's something that's having to be addressed within the industry anyway, because it's just people receiving so many prompts on their mobile phones that they just keep hitting approve without thinking about what they're doing. And one of the tactics that's been used by an attacker who's got a password for an account that's protected by MFA, they just keep bombarding it with prompts until the person accidentally or just hits the approve button and they're into the account. It's why MFA is only 99.9% effective, because you've got that little bit left over, which is the human element, which is where it goes wrong. And there are other ways of getting around that. You find, I'm sure plenty of people have noticed the kind of QR codes, and even in things like station car parks, they'll stick a sticker over the QR code for people to pay for their parking. It'll take them to a fake app and pay for their parking a different way. And they can use the QR code to try and hijack MFA from accounts. You get an email that looks legitimate, it's well constructed, it's well written. You scan the QR code and it's stolen your multi-factor authentication token and allowed somebody into the account. And it's all about maintaining that awareness all the time of, did I ask it to do that? And if I didn't, then I hit deny until I'm sure.
We had to make a change to our multi-factor authentication app for that exact reason. So now you don't approve, you put in a code, which, you always get feedback from the user community that it's frustrating. Why do I now have to put in a code where I just had to press accept before? So it's an important change, and you've explained the reason behind it, but I think it also leads nicely into that user awareness piece as well. Right, so we're doing these things for a reason, and I think when users don't understand, that's when we kind of get pushback, and you might have an organization that says we don't want to deploy this control because of the feedback we've had from the user group. Whereas when you involve them in that decision, you explain the reasons behind it, I generally find the acceptance rates are higher and people understand the risks and why they're being asked to do these things. So yeah, it's ever evolving and we have to make changes, but it's important we bring the users along with us on that journey.
Okay, so maybe that's a good point to actually ask you both, maybe individually, is to sort of, so what would you say would be a good couple of steps, if you like, to getting to secure? And obviously, like I said, we've got some other sessions that will hopefully explain certain areas in more detail, but at a high level, what would you recommend? I'll start with yourself, Dave.
Okay, so for me, I think it's a tricky question to answer because most of the customers I speak to are somewhere different on that security maturity curve. So for one customer, it might be deploying multi-factor authentication if they're maybe a little bit lower down that security maturity curve. Whereas for someone else, it could be zero trust. I think so. In answer to the question, I think for me, it's about having some kind of assessment, either from there's tools and things that Microsoft offer through our partnerships, or I know that you guys have a range of assessments and so on. And that for me is where I would start. I would start with, where are we today on that security maturity curve, if we want to call it that, and where do we want to be? What is our appetite for risk? What regulations do we have to comply with? And then you can start to plot a journey from where you are to where you want to be. But for me, it's a slight cop-out answer, but it's different for everyone, right? But I think you start with that consultancy-based approach.
Yeah, I think, echoing that maturity is variable, and we talk later in other sessions about the journey to understanding maturity and how to get to a good or safer place. But for me, it does begin with, if you haven't got multi-factor authentication everywhere, then you have a problem. And it's kind of a twofold problem, because one is you're missing the technology, and two is you're missing the awareness and the impetus to get that implemented as quickly as possible. So there's two problems there, and you have to start with getting the awareness built so that people understand why it's important, and from the top down as well, because if it's not led from the top, then it won't succeed. You can't have an organization where everybody's got multi-factor authentication apart from the finance director and the CEO. It has to start there and work its way down, because you leave the highest risk people the most exposed. And beyond there, it does again depend on what are you trying to achieve from a security standpoint, because different organizations need different things.
Well, thank you very much for your time, gents. That's been really helpful. Hopefully it's helped you out there as well. We've got plenty of more topics and talking points in our other sessions as well, so please do join us for those.